Right now, literally as we speak, we're in the middle of a massive global crisis. And no, I'm not talking about an economic crash or some sudden geopolitical conflict. I mean a crisis that goes largely unnoticed, just kind of spreading quietly like a cancer. It's a silent, worldwide crisis in education. You see, radical changes are happening right now in what democratic societies teach their kids. Thirsty for national profit, nations are heedlessly tossing aside the exact skills needed to keep democracies alive.
Okay, let's dive into this. This incredibly poignant warning comes from Rabindranath Tagore. He was an Indian Nobel Prize laureate and a leading educational innovator, and he said this way back in 1917. He warned that the moral man was making room for the commercial man. He actually described it as a gradual suicide by the shrinkage of the soul. He saw that this obsessive focus on material possessions and pure profit threatened to completely obscure our deeply human side. And honestly, a century later, his warning has literally never been more relevant.
So to unpack exactly how this shrinkage of the soul is happening today, we're going to use this fascinating foundational text as our guide, Martha C. Nussbaum's Not-for-Profit. Her core thesis is as bold as it is urgent. She argues that cutting the humanities and the arts poses a fatal threat to democratic self-government. If this trend keeps up, she says, nations all over the world are just going to be producing generations of useful machines, rather than complete citizens who can actually think for themselves.
Here's our roadmap for this explainer. We'll start with the silent education crisis, then look at two models of education, the human development paradigm, the inner psychological clash, where we're actually going to pivot from macro policy right down to the micropsychology of a developing infant, and finally, we'll cover cultivating democratic citizens.
Section 1, the silent education crisis.
Let's look at exactly how nations are rapidly discarding the skills that keep democracies breathing. The symptoms of this educational cancer, they're popping up everywhere. The arts and humanities are being slashed in primary, secondary, and university education all over the globe. Why? Well, because policymakers see them as useless frills in a super competitive global market. For example, just look at the 2006 Spellings Commission report in the United States. It focused entirely on education for national economic gain. It pushed highly applied learning for quick profits, while the humanities and critical thinking were practically non-existent in the report. We even see this at elite institutions, like the Laboratory School in Chicago, where wealthy parents are reportedly pressuring teachers to drop imaginative, critical skills in favor of highly testable, financially lucrative skills.
Section 2, two models of education.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the stark, head-to-head battle between two fundamentally different national goals. Is the ultimate goal of a nation simply to increase its gross national product per capita? Or is the goal to create a stable, egalitarian democracy? The model you choose completely dictates the kind of education system you build. If you look over at the education for profit column, the goal is straightforward: economic growth. To get that, sure, you need basic literacy and a small technical elite. But crucially, you absolutely do not want critical thinking. Why? Because the profit model actively discourages critical thought. Frankly, it needs docile bureaucrats and obedient workers who aren't going to question authority or challenge staggering social inequalities. A pure profit model doesn't care at all if the rural poor remain uneducated, just as long as that aggregate GDP goes up. On the flip side, education for democracy demands that we confront historical injustices and foster immense empathy. It requires complete citizens, not just compliant cogs in a giant economic machine. Section 3, the human development paradigm. So, if we reject that pure profit model, what's the alternative? Well, it's the human development paradigm. This model prioritizes individual human dignity and equal opportunities way over aggregate economic growth. But to pull this off, a nation needs to produce humane citizens, and that requires cultivating a very specific set of abilities. Citizens have to be able to think critically, not just blindly defer to tradition. They need to recognize others as true equals, totally regardless of race, gender, or religion. And maybe most importantly, they must have the ability to imagine complex human stories, to genuinely grasp what policies actually mean for the everyday lives of the marginalized. Section 4, the inner psychological clash. Let's move to and see how this builds, because to truly understand why cultivating these complete citizens is so incredibly hard, we have to zoom way, way in, down to the intensely personal micro-level psychology of human development. Nussbaum maps out this fascinating pipeline. It all starts with the infant.
Human infants are born uniquely helpless, right? They experience this jolting alternation between blissful completeness and agonizing powerlessness, and this helplessness breeds a deep, primitive shame. The child realizes, hey, I'm not omnipotent. From there, to cope with that intense shame, the child develops disgust, which ultimately leads right into stigmatizing outgroups.
Let's look a little closer at that wild transition from shame to stigmatizing, which is driven by something called projective disgust. As kids grow up, they get deeply anxious about their own bodily functions, their animality, and eventually their mortality. The desire for infantile omnipotence, that very natural, if slightly tyrannical urge to make their parents their personal servants just to control their environment, it curdles into something dangerous. To distance themselves from their own animal nature, humans project those dirty properties onto subordinate groups. They basically treat marginalized people as a contaminating buffer zone between themselves and their own feared mortality.
To make this concept super relatable, just think back to the childhood game of the cootie catcher. We see projective disgust begin very, very early in life. Kids use magical thinking to identify some unpopular kids as dirty, actively trying to catch and then avoid their alleged disgustingness. It seems like innocent playground play, but it's the exact same psychological dynamic that adults mirror through racism, classism, and casteism. The dominant group defines itself as pure and superior by actively avoiding bodily contact with a subordinate group they've suddenly deemed contaminated. It's a deeply rooted psychological desire to dominate, and it is a massive, constant threat to democratic equality.
Section 5. Cultivating democratic citizens. So, if this urge to build social hierarchies is basically hardwired into our early psychology, how in the world do we fight it? Well, the antidote is the cultivation of empathy, specifically through what's called positional thinking. This is the ability to literally see the world from another person's or creature's viewpoint. Now, empathy by itself isn't morality, right? A sadist can use empathy to figure out exactly how to hurt someone the most, but psychological experiments, like those run by C. Daniel Batson, show that when people are asked to attend to a vivid narrative of someone else's plight and really take up their point of view, they are far more likely to respond with true compassionate concern and actually offer help. Positional thinking supplies the absolutely crucial ingredients for morality. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly why the humanities and the arts are totally non-negotiable for a democracy. Art is the great enemy of moral obtuseness. When we read literature or watch theater or study history through the eyes of the marginalized, we are quite literally practicing positional thinking. We're forcing our imaginations beyond our comfortable everyday confines. The humanities teach us to see others not as tools or instruments for our own profit, but as complex, equal human beings with souls. Which brings us to our final vital question. I want you to look around at your local schools, your universities, your national policies. As they slash the arts to optimize for standardized testing and short-term economic gains, we really have to ask ourselves, are we raising complete citizens capable of sustaining a true democracy, or are we just churning out useful, profitable machines? The future of our entire world order basically depends on how we choose to answer that question. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll catch you next time.